Proverbs says, "The blessing of the Lord makes rich." Ecclesiastes says, "Wealth is meaningless." Jesus warns that storing treasures on earth can cost you your soul. So which one is it? Does God bless prosperity or quietly warn you away from it? Because if Scripture is truly inspired, contradiction isn't possible, which means the problem isn't the Bible. The problem is how we've been taught to read it. Most people grow up hearing the same message, just dressed in different words. Money is dangerous. Struggle builds character. Stability can make you drift from God. And if your finances feel tight, stressful, or unstable, that's just part of faith. So you accept it. You pray more. You work harder. You try to stay grateful while quietly feeling exhausted. But something inside you resists that explanation. Because the same Bible that warns against loving money describes Abraham as extremely wealthy. The same scriptures that call riches temporary show Joseph managing entire economies. And the same Jesus who warned about Mammon never condemned provision, planning, or increase. So, what's actually being warned against? You've probably heard sermons on this. Sermons that sounded humble, sermons that encouraged endurance, sermons that told you to wait patiently and trust God more. And maybe you did, faithfully, for years, yet nothing really changed. Not the tension you feel when money comes up, not the anxiety around provision, not the quiet confusion about whether wanting stability is spiritual or dangerous. That confusion isn't a lack of faith, it's a signal. Almost no one ever explains the original language behind Jesus' warnings. Almost no one goes back to the systems he was confronting, and almost no one tells you that Scripture makes a sharp distinction between money itself and the structure of trust built around it. Because Jesus wasn't attacking provision, he was exposing a competing source. In the first century, Mammon wasn't just currency. It was an entire system, one that promised security, identity, and control while slowly replacing God as the source. A system that worked quietly, efficiently, and spiritually neutral until it wasn't. And here's the uncomfortable truth most believers never hear. You can sincerely love God and still be living under a system that was never designed to serve Him. If you've prayed, given, waited, and still feel divided inside about money, this video is for you. Not because God is withholding, but because you were never taught how to recognize the difference between God's economy and the world's system. What we're about to uncover isn't motivational, it's revelatory. We're going back to Scripture, back to language, back to the patterns that repeat across the lives of people who walked closely with God and still prospered with purpose. And once you see this, you won't be able to unsee it. You'll never read these verses the same way again. You'll never hear certain teachings the same way again. And you'll finally understand why so many sincere believers feel stuck. Not because they lack faith, but because they've been trusting a system that quietly competes with God. Stay with me. What comes next will challenge everything you thought you understood about money, obedience, and alignment. And if something inside you already feels exposed, that's not coincidence. If you're the kind of person who feels that faith was never meant to be shallow, take one quiet action right now. Just tap like. Not for the platform, but because it signals that this kind of conversation matters. It tells YouTube that depth matters, that truth matters, and it helps this message reach people who feel the same tension you do, but haven't yet found the words for it. Most people think the conflict between faith and money began in modern times. It didn't. It began thousands of years ago, inside a system so powerful that even God's people were forced to live under it. Jesus addresses this directly in Matthew 6:24. You cannot serve God and Mammon. That verse is usually preached as a warning against greed, but that's not what his audience heard. In first century Judea, Mammon was not just money, it was a system, a way of organizing life around debt, survival, hierarchy, and fear. Rome had perfected it. Taxes were heavy, land was confiscated through debt, people worked endlessly just to stay alive, and religious leaders often told them this pressure was spiritual, that endurance itself was holiness. Jesus speaks into that tension. But here's what almost no one explains. The Aramaic word used for mammon doesn't simply mean wealth, it means that which you trust in for security, and the system you rely on emotionally, psychologically, existentially. Mammon wasn't about having money, it was about where your sense of safety lived. That changes everything. Now step back to an earlier moment in Scripture. A man named Abraham stands before the king of Sodom in Genesis 14. The king offers him wealth, resources, power, and Abraham refuses. He says, "I will take nothing, so that you will never say, 'I made Abram rich.'" Most sermons frame this as humility, but there's more happening. Archaeological records from Mesopotamia show that kings routinely used gifts to establish lifelong economic dependence. If Abraham accepted the wealth, he would be bound into Sodom's system. Protected, yes. Provided for, yes, but no longer free in allegiance. Abraham doesn't reject wealth. He rejects a system that would claim ownership over his increase. That distinction matters more than people realize. Fast forward to today. Most people watching this pray for provision. They ask God to bless their work, their finances, their future, but at the same time they live inside systems that quietly shape their decisions through fear. Fear of not having enough, fear of losing status, fear of falling behind, and no one ever told them that fear is the true problem Scripture confronts. Here's the modern mistake. Verses meant to expose false trust get taught as condemnations of growth itself. Jesus warns against storing treasure on earth, so people assume planning is unspiritual. Ecclesiastes calls wealth meaningless, so people assume desire is dangerous. Proverbs praises diligence, but that gets overshadowed by guilt whenever progress appears. But Scripture never taught contradiction, it taught discernment. When Jesus spoke about treasure, he wasn't rejecting preparation, he was confronting misplaced identity. He wasn't saying, "Don't build." He was saying, "Don't anchor your soul to what can collapse." That misunderstanding changed how I prayed. For years, I asked God for clarity, provision, stability. But underneath those prayers was hesitation, a quiet belief that wanting more alignment, more margin, more peace might somehow distance me from God. So I stayed stuck between desire and guilt. That tension didn't come from Scripture, it came from how Scripture was taught. Once you realize Mammon is about trust, not totals, the Bible stops sounding anti-abundance and starts sounding anti-enslavement. Look closely at the lives of people God used. Abraham was wealthy but unattached. Joseph managed entire economies but trusted God, not Pharaoh. David prepared resources for the temple long before it was built. None of them avoided structure. None of them worshipped it either. That's the pattern that gets lost. The error of modern interpretation isn't that people love money too much. It's that they were never taught how to relate to systems without surrendering identity. So people either chase money anxiously or avoid it spiritually. Both reactions come from the same confusion. Here's the hard truth most never hear. You can pray sincerely and still live under a system that shapes you through fear. You can love God deeply and still organize your life around survival instead of alignment. And that doesn't make you sinful. It means you were never given the right framework. Once you see that, everything shifts. Work becomes stewardship, not struggle. Planning becomes wisdom, not distrust. Growth becomes responsibility, not rebellion. And suddenly the Bible sounds consistent again. You've probably believed this verse said that faith requires avoiding prosperity. It never did. Here's where the internal conflict most believers feel finally makes sense. Because when people read the Bible on money, they don't encounter one clear message. They encounter tension. Proverbs says, "The blessing of the Lord makes rich, and he adds no sorrow with it." Ecclesiastes says, "Wealth is meaningless." Jesus warns against storing treasures on earth. Paul says contentment matters more than abundance. Read quickly. These verses feel like they're pulling in opposite directions. And when no one explains the context, culture, or language, the result isn't clarity. It's paralysis. So believers default to one of two extremes. Some spiritualize struggle. They assume pressure proves faith. They interpret lack as humility. They feel suspicious of stability, even when they're exhausted. Others chase security anxiously, driven by fear, guilt, or comparison, while praying for peace they never quite feel. Both groups think the problem is inside them. It isn't. This isn't a lack of faith issue. It's a lens issue. Ecclesiastes was written as wisdom literature, not instruction. It describes life when God is removed from the center, not a command to reject provision. The phrase meaningless in Hebrew, hevel, means vapor, temporary, unstable. It's a warning against building identity on what can disappear, not a condemnation of having resources. Jesus' warning about treasure isn't about planning or saving. It's about allegiance. He speaks to people living under Roman systems, where land, debt, and survival controlled identity. His concern was never provision. It was where trust settled when pressure arrived. Paul's teaching on contentment wasn't anti-growth. It was anti-dependence. He made it clear he knew both scarcity and abundance and wasn't ruled by either. His warning wasn't "don't have." It was "don't be owned." When you read these verses without cultural context, they collide. When you read them correctly, they align. And once that alignment clicks, a pattern emerges that almost no one points out. Solomon is the first example people misunderstand. He's often reduced to a lesson about wealth corrupting wisdom. But Scripture is precise. Solomon didn't lose clarity when wealth increased. He lost clarity when trust shifted. When alliances, control, and security replaced dependence on God, discernment faded. Wealth wasn't the poison. Misplaced trust was. Paul follows the same pattern. He worked, produced, funded his mission, and moved freely across economic systems. He wasn't defined by lack or abundance. He was anchored somewhere deeper. That's why he could function under pressure without fear. He understood structure without surrendering identity. Then there's Lydia, a figure many sermons skip entirely. She was a dealer in purple cloth, a luxury trade connected to elite markets. She was wealthy, connected, and influential. And Scripture doesn't rebuke her, it highlights her responsiveness to God. Her resources became a platform for hospitality and impact, not a barrier to faith. Even Jesus fits this pattern in ways that make people uncomfortable. He didn't reject systems outright, he operated within them. He spoke fluently about investment, stewardship, debt, and planning because these were realities people lived in. His confrontation was never with provision. It was with systems that enslaved people through fear and identity. Different lives, different eras. Same principle. None of them worshipped money, none of them avoided structure, all of them understood the difference between source and system. That's the pattern tradition often buries. When you translate this into modern life, the implications are immediate. An entrepreneur who builds thoughtfully isn't unspiritual. A professional who seeks stability isn't faithless. A missionary who manages resources wisely isn't compromising. The issue has never been participation in systems. The issue is what you trust when pressure comes. Most believers feel guilty for wanting progress because they were taught an incomplete story. They were told faith means letting go, but not taught how to discern what to hold loosely and what to steward intentionally. So they live divided, praying for provision while fearing growth, asking for peace while avoiding responsibility, wanting freedom while staying trapped in familiar systems that drain them. That tension doesn't come from God. It comes from collapsing verses that were never meant to be collapsed. Once you recognize the pattern, Solomon, Paul, Lydia, even Jesus, the fog lifts. Scripture stops arguing with itself, and your internal conflict finally has an explanation. You weren't wrong to feel confused. You were missing the lens. Now this is where everything turns inward. Because up to this point we've talked about scripture, systems and patterns. But if this message is going to matter, it has to confront something personal. Something you've felt, but maybe never named. So don't answer quickly. Let these questions sit. Are you afraid of prospering because somewhere along the way it started to feel unspiritual? Not greedy, not selfish, just wrong. Have you ever felt a quiet discomfort when things started to improve? As if stability might dull your dependence on God? As if peace could somehow be a spiritual risk? That fear didn't come from Scripture, it came from confusion. Another question, have you confused wisdom with fear? Because there's a difference between humility and hesitation, a difference between trusting God and avoiding responsibility. Yet many people were taught that not planning proves faith, that staying reactive keeps you spiritual, that long-term thinking is a lack of trust. But fear often disguises itself as spirituality. Fear says, don't grow too much. Fear says, don't aim too high. Fear says, if you have more, you might lose God. Wisdom never says that. Wisdom says, align first. Wisdom says, build with clarity. Wisdom says, let provision serve purpose. So here's another question that goes even deeper. Does your money serve purpose, or do you serve it? That question exposes more than most sermons ever will, because serving money doesn't always look like greed. Sometimes it looks like anxiety. Sometimes it looks like obsession. Sometimes it looks like constantly checking balances, worrying about the future, or feeling trapped in decisions you don't know how to change. And sometimes it looks like avoiding money conversations altogether because they make you uncomfortable. Both extremes are forms of servitude. Now let's go even further. When pressure hits, when bills stack up, when uncertainty shows up, when life demands a decision, what do you trust first? Do you default to panic, to control, to exhaustion, or do you return to alignment? Most people don't realize this, but your first reaction under pressure reveals your true source. Not what you say you trust, what you actually lean on when things feel unstable. And here's the part that often lands the hardest. If you've been taught that struggle is spiritual, then peace can feel suspicious. If you've been taught that lack keeps you humble, then increase can feel dangerous. If you've been taught that money corrupts, then stewardship feels like compromise. Those beliefs don't come from the Bible. They come from misapplied teaching passed down without examination, and they quietly shape your prayers, your decisions, and your self-image. You might pray for provision while subconsciously resisting the responsibility that comes with it. You might ask God for favor while fearing what growth would require from you. You might desire freedom while clinging to systems that feel familiar, even if they drain you. That internal conflict is exhausting, and it's not because you're doing something wrong. It's because no one ever gave you language for the tension you've been carrying. So let me ask you this, not as a teacher, but as someone walking this journey too. Which of these questions hit you hardest? Was it the fear of prospering because it feels unspiritual? Was it realizing you may have confused wisdom with fear? Or was it the question of whether your money serves purpose or quietly controls you? Drop a comment with the one that stood out to you. I actually read them, and it's how I choose what to unpack next, because these conversations matter when they're honest. And as you sit with that question, notice what comes up. Not judgment, not pressure, just awareness. Because awareness is the beginning of freedom. When you stop fighting the tension and start understanding it, faith becomes lighter, decisions become clearer, and alignment stops feeling abstract. It becomes practical. This isn't about becoming wealthy, it's about becoming whole. And that wholeness begins the moment you're willing to question what you were taught, instead of questioning yourself. If you're still here, you're not casual. You didn't click out, you didn't scroll away. You stayed because something in this message resonated deeper than information. That already sets you apart. What we uncovered today wasn't a new doctrine or a clever idea. It was a lens, a way of seeing Scripture that removes the false tension so many believers carry between faith and provision, trust and wisdom, obedience and responsibility. We saw that the Bible never condemned money, it never praised confusion, and it never asked you to live divided. What Scripture consistently challenges is misplaced trust. We looked at how Jesus wasn't confronting provision, but allegiance. How Abraham rejected a system that wanted credit for what God provided. How Joseph mastered powerful economies without being owned by them. How Solomon, Paul, Lydia, and even Jesus himself operated within structures while keeping their identity anchored elsewhere. Different people, different eras. Same pattern: source over system, alignment over fear, wisdom without surrender. If you felt tension lifting as this unfolded, that wasn't coincidence. That was clarity replacing confusion. And clarity is something many people spend their entire lives searching for. So if you're still here, understand this: you're not behind, you're not broken, and you're not lacking faith. You were simply taught fragments instead of the full picture, and now that picture is coming into focus. But this conversation isn't finished, because there's a verse near the very beginning of Scripture that almost everyone reads the same way, and almost everyone reads it wrong. It's a line in Genesis that's been used for generations to explain why work feels heavy, why provision feels hard, and why struggle is treated as normal. Many people believe it proves that difficulty and scarcity are God's design. But when you slow down, examine the original language, and understand the context, something startling emerges. The verse doesn't say what tradition claims it says, and once you see what it actually means, it reframes everything: your work, your effort, your expectations, and why so many sincere believers feel stuck financially while doing everything they were taught was right. That's what we're unpacking next. So don't stop here. Watch the next video. Not because it promises shortcuts, but because it completes the foundation we started laying today. And if this brought clarity where there was confusion, subscribe. This isn't a channel for shallow faith or recycled answers. It's for people who want to understand Scripture deeply and live aligned, internally and practically. You're not chasing prosperity, you're reclaiming alignment. And once you see through the lens of Scripture clearly, you don't go back. You move forward with wisdom, peace, and purpose. If this resonated with you, subscribe. This isn't just a channel, it's a growing community of people who are done with shallow answers and inherited confusion. We go deeper here. We question honestly. We study Scripture with clarity and courage, and we walk this journey together, aligned in faith, wisdom, and purpose.